Hello, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Kei Ikawa, Managing Director of Asia Pacific for Continental Airlines. Continental is very proud and honored to sponsor this conference at the Baker Institute on America and China the next 30 years. Although Continental's history in China is rather brief, with Hong Kong and our Beijing flight only not even 4 years old, on this 30th anniversary year of normalization between the U.S. and China, we're pleased to add another China route as we launched the daily nonstop flight to Shanghai last week. I hope to see many of you on our Continental flights to China to help closer ties between the U.S. and China. Now it is my pleasure to introduce the panel today, moderated by Ambassador Edward Jurigian. Ambassador Jurigian is the founding director of the Baker Institute, as well as its Robert and Janice McNair Chair in Public Policy. The ambassador is one of the nation's most distinguished diplomats with a career spanning 8 U.S. administrations. As a former U.S. ambassador to Syria and Israel under a Republican and a Democratic administration, he is quite bipartisan, he tells me. As a former U.S. ambassador, Ambassador Jurigian is a leading expert on the complex political, security, economic, religious, and ethnic issues of the Middle East, as he continues to be quite involved. And also, I might add, a million-miler on Continental Airlines. Thank you. I would like to now welcome Ambassador to the podium to moderate our first panel on the broader Middle East, U.S.-Chinese interests and policies. Ambassador Jurigian.
Thank you very much, and thank you for Continental Airlines in supporting our conference. We have an excellent panel today to discuss the issue of U.S., China, and the Middle East, which is a key issue, as you have heard from our keynote speakers, the issues of Iran, Pakistan, Arab-Israeli proliferation, etc. Because of one of our panelists' travel schedules, I'm going to jumpstart by asking Dan Kurtzer to give his purview, because he's going to have to leave the panel, unfortunately, to catch his plane. So let me introduce Dan first. He holds the Danny Abraham Chair in Middle East Policy Studies at Princeton University at the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs. I have known Dan for many years. We worked closely together on Middle East issues. He was truly one of my most trusted and close collaborators when we put together the Madrid Peace Conference and other key issues. He served as U.S. Ambassador to Israel and then U.S. Ambassador to Egypt earlier. He was an advisor to our Iraq study group, and he's the co-author with Scott Lesensky of Negotiating Arab-Israeli Peace, American Leadership in the Middle East, which is a rather candid survey of American involvement in peacemaking. Join me in welcoming Dan Kurtzer.
Good morning. I want to thank Ed Jurigian and the Baker Institute and the Shanghai Institutes for the invitation to join you today for this conference. I also want to ask Ed if he would convey my thanks and appreciation to Secretary Baker in particular for giving me the privilege over the years of working with him and learning so much from him about what our diplomacy in fact can achieve. There are times in which I actually regret having worked for Secretary Baker, because when you work for the best, everything that follows doesn't quite match that standard. I approach the issues of U.S.-China interests and policies in the Middle East from the perspective of one who has spent an entire lifetime, both as a student, as a diplomat, and now as a professor, working in an area in which nuance and indirection do not characterize discourse. The Middle East is an in-your-face diplomatic venue, and there is very little nuance in the exchanges when we talk about this region. So if I talk from this perspective, it is not out of a lack of respect for either our own policies or those of China, but rather in an effort to try to get to what our keynote speakers talked about this morning, which is the place at which, through mutuality, equality, and reciprocity, we can find bridges of understanding, cooperation, and collaboration on the key issues in the Middle East, which occupy both our attention and our policymakers' sometimes worst nightmares. In the late 1980s, when I traveled once to the Middle East with former Secretary of State George P. Shultz, an editorial in an Israeli newspaper greeted him by saying, "Welcome to the Middle East, a place where we do mud wrestling, and unless you are ready to join us in that contest, it's probably better for you to go home." I won't do mud wrestling today, but I will be rather blunt in my analysis of the kinds of issues that face us in our respective bilateral relationships in the region, as well as in our collective approach to the problems of that area. The three issues that I want to talk about today, which is, number one, the problems that are endemic to the Middle East and seem impervious to change, and the approach of China and the United States to those problems. Number two, the question not so much of what we heard this morning of energy security, but rather the security of energy supplies. And I will look at it from a slightly different perspective, from questions of pricing and supply. And third, the Arab-Israeli conflict are three areas in which the United States and China stand at a great crossroads of possibilities for the kind of collaboration and cooperation in our policy approaches which can make a great difference in resolving some of the problems in this very important region. The first question, which relates to the security of energy supplies. Let me start with a vignette from a conference I attended about a year ago in Doha, in which I was asked to address this question. And I noted that after examining the history of U.S. security responsibilities in the Gulf, I posed the question of whether it remained in the sole interest of the United States to be the only guarantor of security for the export of the region's fossil fuels, of its oil and gas. And I noted at that conference, as I will repeat today, that this is not an academic question. In 2006, Gulf countries produced about 28% of the world's oil, exported 18.2 million barrels per day, held 55% of the world's oil reserves. Of this, the U.S. imported 2.2 million barrels per day, which represented about 17% of our total imports. And in 2006, of those oil exports, about 93% of it transited through the Gulf, through the Straits of Hormuz. There are few alternative export routes. There is not enough of a pipeline infrastructure to accommodate the oil exports, and therefore there is a need to look at the area of security of oil and gas exports. The dangers are great. Within striking range of the Gulf, there are 8 nuclear weapons states: the US, the UK, France, Russia, China, Israel, if it holds nuclear weapons, India, and Pakistan. And Iran, as we know, is actively pursuing a nuclear weapons capability. This is a region beset by endemic military conflict and instability. And in the past 30 years, we have seen bloody wars in the immediate neighborhood, the immediate vicinity of this important export route: the Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s, the first Gulf War, the 2003 United States invasion of Iraq, and a number of unresolved and potentially explosive territorial conflicts, including over the islands in the Gulf itself. Now, given the extraordinary profitability of low production cost oil and the high vulnerability of this regime to external threats, over the years, the U.S. built up an impressive security framework in the Gulf, comprising a number of bases and facilities and the stationing of a permanent U.S. naval presence. The economic cost of these activities has been extraordinarily high, with a low estimate of about $33 billion a year for the United States and upper range estimates that could approach more than $100 billion a year. The political cost, though harder to quantify, is also high, as many in the region resent the fact that the United States has built up this security framework for what is often perceived as U.S. economic interests alone. So for these reasons, I raised at the Doha conference and raised today the question of whether alternative models for providing security for the export of fossil fuels from the Gulf should be considered. For example, the idea of a multilateral security framework comprised of both regional and extra-regional players and funded by an additional tax on the exports of the oil and the gas. This is an issue in which the United States and China have at least an equal measure of interest and an equal measure of policy to consider. Because if the Gulf and its oil and gas are important to the United States, they are more important to China, and increasingly so. And so this is the first question on which there is room not just for consideration, but for a deep policy dialogue between our two countries to see whether or not some kind of an alternative to the current monopoly of a U.S. security framework can be considered that would be in the best interests of both countries. The second issue I want to discuss involves the Arab-Israeli conflict. About a week ago, I was at a conference in Beirut. I love the life of an academic because one can spend a great deal of time traveling to these conferences as long as we show up at class on Monday afternoon. This conference in Beirut dealt with regional solutions to regional conflicts. And there were a number of American and European participants along with Arab participants from a number of states in the region. And at one point, the question turned to whether or not the United States should continue to exercise what has traditionally been a dominant role as the third-party, honest broker, mediator in the Arab-Israeli conflict. And we talked about the possibilities of others joining the United States in this effort. For example, for the past few years, there has been a quartet in which the United Nations, the European Union, and Russia, along with the United States, have sought to concert their policies and approaches as a means of conveying to the parties in the Arab-Israeli conflict that there is a consensus will in the international community which cannot be broken by the parties. And the issue of China's involvement in the peace process came up. Now, we heard earlier this morning from the ambassador that China has had an envoy to the Middle East peace process and has just appointed a new envoy. And yet, when this was pointed out to one of the Arab participants, he recalled a conversation in which he was talking to a Chinese diplomat and said, "What is your idea for resolving the Arab-Israeli conflict?" And the Chinese diplomat's response was, "We wish the parties the best of luck." Now, I say this not as a form of criticism. I say this as a form of an invitation in which the United States can no longer assume a monopoly role in trying to bring about a settlement, a negotiated settlement of the Arab-Israeli conflict. And if, in fact, both the United States and China, along with European and other international players, have equal interests in this region, then we have to find a way to translate those interests into common policies which convey more than a hope for a resolution of this conflict. And there are many ways to do this. Just in light of the recent conflict in Gaza, for example, there is a need for a multiplicity of tasks in order to stabilize the situation, to make sure that the ceasefire that was reached at the end of the Gaza war is implemented, to try to bring about a multilateral framework for ensuring that smuggling of arms and other lethal material does not continue into Gaza, to try to bring about the reconstruction and humanitarian relief that the people in Gaza require, and to try to translate these on-the-ground immediate measures into a resumption of negotiations. This is not a task for American diplomacy alone. And it is a task in which I am confident our policymakers would welcome an active, engaged, and vibrant role by China in assuming some of these responsibilities and engaging with us to develop a coordinated and concerted approach to the resolution of this conflict. The third issue I want to talk about is the economic, social, and political environment in the Middle East. I've spent some time since leaving government service about 3 years ago, stepping back from the day-to-day diplomacy, the kind of problem-solving, the fix-it approach that characterizes too much of our diplomacy, and have been struck by the degree to which, while we have been absorbed by trying to resolve the proximate issues at dispute in the Middle East, the region has proven to be almost immune from positive change. Many of the issues that we could have talked about as characterizing the Middle East 20, 30, 40 years ago remain with us today in much more intensified way. It's a region that's beset by problems that seem impervious to amelioration: debilitating poverty and economic inequality, the misuse of the extraordinary wealth being generated by oil and gas sales, wars and violence both within and between states, and the cancer of terrorism fueled by often misguided religious ideologies. The state structure of this region, largely a product of the past century and the process of decolonization after World War II, is in disarray today, and its foundations are weakening daily. The region is characterized by weak regimes, crises of legitimacy, succession struggles that go on even after a succession takes place, and internal societal tensions which are exacerbated by almost unstoppable demographic growth, the growing requirement of importation of food, and the inability of most of these societies to create enough jobs for the growing population. There has been, on top of this, exceedingly little progress toward the growth of open societies, both economically open and politically open. Now, interestingly, as one travels through the region, one hears that, well, we are looking to emulate the Chinese model. I'm not an expert on China, and I don't even know if there is a Chinese model. But there are Middle Eastern states that believe that they can gain the benefits of the extraordinary economic growth that China has experienced without undergoing the kind of societal change and political change which is very much part and parcel of the debate in contemporary China. In other words, it seems that there are some in the Middle East who are looking for the economic benefits of growth, but are not looking at themselves the way the Chinese are and seeing the relationship between economic and political development. Now, in political science, there are those, and in economic theory, there are those who argue that economic liberalization and economic development are, in fact, prerequisites for political liberalization. And there are those who argue the opposite, that in order to achieve economic growth and development, one must start with political liberalization. And then, of course, there's a third view, the view, for example, of the late Mansour Olson, who argued that you need both going hand in hand. For society truly to develop, it must move simultaneously and in a parallel way between its economic policies and growth and its political liberalization. So the Chinese model that many in the Middle East think they are following may in fact not be a Chinese model at all. But the reason I say this is because this is an opportunity. It is a problem for the region, but an opportunity for the United States and China to do some very intensive thinking about how the two of us can work together in order to promote both the economic growth of this region, which is absolutely required, but also the political liberalization in this region, also required. Now, I speak this with the humility required of American officials and academics, because we don't have the answers to these questions. And some of our own misguided policies over the past years have shown that what we thought we knew, in fact, we do not know. And so this is not just an issue on which the region itself would benefit from China-US cooperation, but in which United States and China can learn from each other. The mistakes of our own policies, the mistakes of our respective approaches, and build upon them to try to create an infrastructure within this region in which the resolution of particular crises, be they the Arab-Israeli, be they the Iran nuclear issue, which we talked about this morning, or be they the endemic problems to which I referred earlier, can actually be addressed and hopefully resolved. So, as we look at these questions in the context of this conference, a conference which has been launched by three very thoughtful addresses about the overall nature of our relationships, three ways of addressing not just the past 30 years' experiences, but learning from them as we move ahead to the next 30 and 60 and 90 years. Clearly, the conference organizers have chosen this panel on the Middle East because of its particular salience, both to world stability, but also because of the prospects it holds out for U.S.-Chinese collaboration and cooperation. Now, diplomats will very often use those words as a means of avoiding the very challenging details, the differences of view, the points not of convergence but of divergence between our approaches. And no longer being a diplomat, I will tell you that I use those words differently. That the collaboration, cooperation, and convergence of our interests and policies are not just useful for our two countries, but imperative for regional development, regional stability, and in fact, the progress of stability and growth of our two societies in the world. I think with the kind of effort that we have put into our bilateral relationship between the United States and China over the past 30 years, if we start addressing the particular problems of this region with the same vigor and determination over the next 30 years, we can find a region which will not only not be able to exploit the differences between us, as they sought to do so often during the Cold War, but rather a region confronted by two determined superpowers, intent upon seeing this region become a model for U.S.-Chinese collaboration, and therefore for Middle East economic and political development. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dan. Dan has to leave immediately in order to make that class, or else he'll be in trouble at Princeton. Thank you very much for those insightful remarks, Dan Kurtzer. It's now my pleasure to invite to the podium our participant from SIIS, Li Weijian. Professor Li has lived and traveled extensively in the Middle East and has spent quite a bit of time in Cairo, you know. He's currently the Director and Senior Fellow of the Department of West Asian and African Studies at SIIS. He's also a Standing Council member of China Association for Middle East Studies. He received his PhD at SISU, and his research interests focus on Middle East politics, energy, culture, and China-Middle East relations. So he's a perfect candidate for our panel. Join me in welcoming Professor Li.
Thank you, Chairman, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's my pleasure to present my perspectives on China's Middle East policy and China-US interactions in Middle East issues as a scholar. On China's Middle East policy, I would like to present 3 points. Firstly, the changes of China's Middle East policy is an integrated part of China's foreign policy development. As we know, the current war is undergoing significantly significant transformation and adjustments. The international situation in political, economic, and security aspects appear too complex, multidimensional, and intertwined. To meet the new situation, China needs to formulate external strategies and policies rather in a global perspective than on its own calculation. That is, China would create strategic goals to participate in the establishment of international system through peaceful and diplomatic approaches. Meanwhile, China should accommodate the concept of harmonious world to practices which requires pragmatism and feasibility. In recent years, changes have greatly but precipitously taking place in the concept and practices of China's foreign policy. Based on its previous held principles like mutual respect, mutual beneficiary, and non-interference, China has been more actively engaged in cooperation so as to reduce conflicts, increase consensus, and achieve win-win results. Guided by this principle, China's diplomacy became more active, comprehensive, and rigorous. Regarding major international issues, hotspots, and foreign relations, China would put forward concrete, constructive proposals and suggestions of cooperation rather than merely rise principle as they used to do. Regarding the Middle East issues, the changes is mainly manifested on the changes of concept and the establishment of mechanism promoting its relations with the region. China has adopted more proactive positions and actions promoting regional stability, protecting China's national interests, and serving China's overall diplomacy in comparison to its previous reluctance for more involvement in the Middle East issues. Secondly, China's increasing involvement in Middle East agendas as one of the powers serving regional stability not only conforms to China's reality and the Middle East countries' expectations, but also help to maintain China's national interests. China has neither intentions nor capabilities to become a decisive power on Middle East efforts. Yet, the call from Middle East for China bigger role and the requirement from the international community for China's more responsibility are growing stronger with the increasing of China's overall strength and international influence. Meanwhile, it is natural that China will join in shaping the environment of the region relevant with its interests and become constructive partner facilitating regional stability with the expansions of its nature interests. China has long been committed to developing relations with Middle East countries, including the parties in conflicts, which has become characteristic of China's Middle East diplomacy, different from any other major powers. The recent years have seen that China's Middle East policy has become more rigorous and proactive and more heeding and constructive as well, compared with previous years. That is the difference. Its objectives are also become clear: to maintain regional stability with full efforts to strengthen cooperation with regional countries in all round way, and to serve the purpose of China's stable and rapid economic development. Thirdly, China is attaching more and more importance to Middle East multilateral diplomacy and treating the Middle East as a stage, developing relations with major powers and playing constructive roles. China's policy on various Middle East hotspots is to engage construction of and actively participate in multilateral mechanism. China has become a party of almost all major multilateral diplomatic activities about Middle East issues, and has played important roles in the multilateral mechanism dealing with the Darfur and the Iranian nuclear issue, as our ambassador mentioned this morning. Regarding the Iranian nuclear issue, China will even probably propose new mechanism like 6+1 or 6+2. China is also a party of relevant international conference on Iraq issue, and will probably enhance its involvement. China was invited to Annapolis Middle East Peace Conference, is ready to take part in any new multilateral mechanism, and will play constructive roles, though China is not a member of the quartet. In addition, China will more actively make use of and improve the incumbent multilateral institutions and construct new multilateral institutions to develop all-round cooperation with the Middle East country while strengthening bilateral relations. Co-founded by China and the Arab League, China-Arab Cooperation Forum, which has developed into institution with 11 mechanisms, covered energy cooperation, is increasingly mature. China and the GCC cooperation is also become more and more pragmatic and effective, which might result in new cooperation mechanisms. And now I would like to also like to talk about China and U.S. interactions in the Middle East. As it is known to all, the U.S. factor has always been an important variable of China-Middle East relations, and has always been a challenge in China's handling of Middle East issues and China-Arab relations. On the one hand, China-US relations have long been the priority of the priorities of China's foreign agendas. However, China and the US hold different views on Middle East issues, and China has good relations with countries named by the United States as log states. Therefore, the US has been vigilant on China's involvement in the Middle East. On the other hand, as a result of suspicion of the US, Arab countries expected that China could be a balanced power to check the ever huge US influence in the region, which has strengthened the belief that China and the US are competitor in the region and had greatly restricted China-US interaction in the region. Currently, Obama administration is considering adjusting its Middle East policy, and China is watching closely to possible change, whether it is strategic or technical only. It is our opinion that the new policy is far from being made, but in the stage of assessment. Nevertheless, the impact of the adjustment is global, even it is technical, and will produce substantial impact on China's involvement in the Middle East and further China-US interaction in the Middle East. And the 10 trends of United States policy and its possible impact should be understood within a broader context. First, the international system is undergoing and will continue to experience profound transformations. The growth and the decline of international power has accelerated, and the collective rise of emerging countries forms a strong momentum. The numbers of non-state actors are on the rise. The global issues such as energy security, terrorism, cross-border crimes, financial crisis, and climate changes also increased. Thus, it is increasingly different for each country to get the threats resolved independently in this new world. Consensus on international cooperation to tackle global issues like the Middle East issue has been widely recognized. Second, the most significant challenges facing by the U.S. new administration now is how to prevent economic from further declining. Under the severe pressures of economic issues, it becomes harder for the new administration to invest more on the Middle East issues. Instead, more coordination and cooperation with major power and regional powers will be needed. Meanwhile, the EU, Russians, India, Japan, and other Asian big powers increase strategic attentions and input to the region. Third, China U.S. relations has made great progress in the recent years. Mutual trusts have been strengthened. Global cooperation has also been increased. China's approach of dialogue and cooperation, concepts of harmonious words and actions are recognized by the international community, including the U.S. Perceived from the Obama's intention of adjusting policies to the Middle East, China and the U.S. Converge on the ways of handling many issues. More room for cooperation between China and the U.S. on the Middle East issue will be available in the future. To conclude, it is not difficult to see from the above that there will be closer interactions between China and the U.S. and among China, U.S., and the Middle East countries. No doubt, the U.S. policy adjustments on the Middle East and China's more active positions and participations will have positive implications in promoting favorable interactions among China, the U.S., and Arab countries. That's all of my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
Our third and last panelist is Amy Myers-Jaffe, who is well known to our Baker Institute and Houston audience. Amy is a Princeton University graduate in Arabic Studies. She's the Wally Wilson Fellow in Energy Studies at the Baker Institute. Her research here focuses on oil geopolitics, strategic energy policy, including energy science policy and energy economics. She's widely published and served as co-editor of Energy in the Caspian Region, Natural Gas and Geopolitics from 70 to 2040, Cambridge University. And she was a member of the Reconstruction and Economy Working Group of the Baker Hamilton Iraq Study Group, and she's been involved in many other groups and while a commentator on the media. Amy has been with me for over 9 years here at the Baker Institute, and she leads our very active Energy Forum. So I'd like to welcome Amy Jaffe to the podium.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here and a great honor to be here. Thank you to President Leveren and SIIS for organizing this fantastic program. And it was particularly daunting to come and speak to you after what a great opening session and the other presentations for my session. I have become knowledgeable over the years about energy potential relationship or cooperative relationship between China and the U.S. through a long-standing program of cooperation with SIIS. We have eaten the best food in China, and we have tried to introduce our Chinese delegates to Tex-Mex, and we have had a very productive dialogue over the last several years. And so it's in this context that I make my opening statement, which I think is also reflected in some of the comments that have come before me. We have a unique opportunity today for the United States to chart a new, more creative diplomatic course of engagement on the Middle East together with China. And we have learned, I hope, especially through the financial crisis, which I'll talk about briefly, that competitive frameworks bring, as we say in America, a scourge on both your houses. And I'm tempted to tell an Egyptian fable to make my point, and then I'll continue to sort of elaborate, and that is the story, and the ambassador knows the story well, of the scorpion and the toad. And so the toad is, the scorpion is on the, well, actually it's frog. The scorpion is on the edge of the Nile River, and he sees a frog in the water. and he says that he would be eternally grateful and God would reward him if the frog would take him to the other side of the Nile River. And the frog laughs out loud and says, "You're a scorpion, and why in the world would I let you get on my back? Because you will sting me and I will die." And the scorpion says, "No, no, no." He says, "You're not thinking it through. Float in the water close to the shore, and I will jump on your back. And then you will be guaranteed to know that I cannot sting you, because if I did, we would both drown and die. And why would I do that?" And the frog thinks about it for a moment, and in the glory of Allah, decides that he wants to do this, to put Jewish parlance, mitzvah, to good deed, to gain, positive karma and so forth from God. And so he floats in the water by the edge of the river, asks the scorpion to jump on his back, starts swimming the scorpion across the Nile, and when they get about halfway, the scorpion stings him. And in his last moment of life, before they both die, the frog turns to the scorpion and says, "I don't understand. Why have you done this? We're both about to die." And the scorpion replies, "This is the Middle East. What did you expect?" And I think that there is not only a great lesson in why that tale is repeated for generations in the Middle East, but there is a great lesson in that story for China and the United States. I look forward to presenting to the audience someday in the near future a book that I am presenting with another fellow academic here at Rice, Mahmoud Al-Gamal. And that book looks at the history of the link between financial crises and oil crises. And people don't remember the crisis that came with the dollar in the 1950s, culminating in the 1956 Suez oil crisis. And people don't remember the background of the 1970 to 1972 currency and banking crises that culminated in the 1973 oil embargo. But it is a long series of crises, I won't bore you, going back into the 1800s. And I think that the dynamic between the overlapping interest between China and the United States on oil today is extremely different than it's been in the past. In 1990, when Iraq invaded Kuwait, it was a US and global problem, but it was not fundamentally a Chinese economic problem because China was self-sufficient in energy in 1990. It could abstain at the UN, it had internal fixed prices for energy, and it didn't have to worry about the impact so much of what would the kind of banking and financial crisis would have on its own economy if the Middle East problem was not resolved well. By the flip side, I think the United States has learned from the past decade or more that increasing its growing military presence in the Gulf, which Ambassador Kurtzer outlaid, I think, very well, and the billions and billions of dollars that are now being spent, having more naval ships in the Gulf has not brought us any closer at all, to stability from this dual risk of financial and oil crises. And I think that both countries now are knowledgeable about their joint stake in having a different paradigm. And those paradigms involve both the kinds of interesting policies we saw on the front page of the New York Times yesterday about China taking an advanced role in propelling electric and high technology automobiles, to having the United States partner and do the same thing. But also a joint stake in what Ambassador Kurtzer kind of hinted at, and I would take a step farther. There's been some discussion about perhaps broadening an international consortium to protecting the Strait of Hormuz or seeking peace in the Middle East. But I think people are thinking too small when they look at it that way, and that really the goal should be to completely demilitarize the Strait of Hormuz. And I think that that's possible in today's knowledge of what we all know. And I mentioned this sort of pattern of financial crises and oil crises. And the thing that people don't comment about frequently anymore, but did a lot in the 70s and then sort of forgot about it and became very obsessed with the US-Chinese relationship, is the flow of petrodollar money. So the oil price goes very high, and there's a tremendous amount of income flowing into the Persian Gulf, and the question is, how will those dollars be recycled? What will those countries buy with those dollars, and how much can they absorb in a productive way for their populations? And the pattern that we've seen over the last 5 decades is that not all of that money can go quickly into education or medical services or social welfare. And so a lot of the surplus is squandered out in the financial community buying things like credit swaps and mortgage-backed securities, so it makes the crisis worse. But a lot of those things, quite frankly, are dedicated and funded to buy arms. And then the more arms we have in the region, given the traditional conflicts that don't seem to be able to be resolved, the more likely we are to have something like the 8-year war between Iraq and Iran that led to millions of deaths, and then basically made it almost impossible, as Ambassador Kurtzer mentioned, for those populations to move forward on the important things of social justice, economic development, increasing opportunity. And what I see coming in today's 2008, 2009 crisis was not only the same flow of petrodollars, the same contribution to asset bubbles and irrational exuberance in markets that then deteriorated everybody's wealth, not only in the Middle East, but also in China and the United States, and having to come up with an international pact to try to ameliorate the impact of that crisis. But a frighteningly higher scale of military purchases that are now starting to focus on civilian use of nuclear power that may in the end not wind up being civilian use of nuclear power throughout the Middle East. And the consequences, if we know what the consequences were of conventional arms buildups in the 1980s following the 1973 crisis, and we know how many wars came about in the following decade, we should take a pause in thinking about what it could be like with all this petrodollar money going back into arms purchases and having some of them be more advanced arms. And the United States and China have an equal concern about that, not only because both countries are major oil consumers and large economies, but also because of each country's global role in trying to maintain stability and peace. And so it would be in that context that I say that the goal of trying to demilitarize key areas of the Middle East, especially Strait of Hormuz, plays a very important role. And I'd just like to throw out a few statistics for the audience to munch on over lunch. Because, of course, the main reason that everybody says, Iran says, and everybody says, well, we have to have nuclear power because we cannot meet the needs of our population. And it is true, if you were an average Iranian today, you are experiencing electricity brownouts, shortages, lack of heat supply in the winter, fuel shortages, and so forth. And so it sounds reasonable when you hear your government stand up and say these 2 nuclear plants are extremely necessary. So let me throw out a few statistics. About 2 billion cubic meters a year of natural gas will be freed up by those 2 nuclear plants. But 20.8 billion cubic meters a year could be freed up by just having Iran have a price reform system in its natural gas pricing, which is now done through uneconomic subsidies and programs that have thrown their entire industry and economy off track. And so having a price reform process in Iran that has been implemented by many countries across the world, not only China, but Russia is now engaging in the same kind of programs. We've seen the same kind of programs in Latin America and other places. And so Iran is not a unique country where it can just say, well, we know we have these inefficient subsidies, but our population needs them. Well, you know, everybody's population thinks they need them, but it's holding the country back. The second thing is, even if you say, well, it's easy for me to say standing here in the United States, because I say we should have a high gasoline tax in the United States, and I couldn't get that passed either, so who am I to tell the Iranians that they should lift their subsidies on natural gas fuel for households? Let me just throw out another statistic for you. So while it would be 14 times more efficient for the Iranians to have price reform in natural gas than to build 2 nuclear plants, if they just ended flaring, something they should do as part of a global climate agreement of the natural gas. And for those of you who are not technical in the oil industry, flaring is I'm producing oil and other natural gas and so forth from my fields, and I don't have any useful way, or I could have a useful way to use that natural gas, but it's expensive. And so instead of re-injecting it in the field to increase pressure, or instead of tapping the natural gas to provide electricity somewhere in the country, I'm just letting it float out into the atmosphere, which greatly adds to the burden of greenhouse gases internationally. If the Iranians, which flare 14% of their total natural gas production today, if they were to end that practice and capture that gas for the useful benefit of Iranian citizens, that would provide them with 22 BCM a year, or 8 times the amount of natural gas that they will free up by having 2 nuclear plants. So I do not think in the issue of diplomacy that when we allow the dialogue to focus on the electricity needs or the fuel needs or so forth of the local population, and we in the expert community and also in the diplomatic community do not educate ourselves into the technical details of what's being said so that we can correct the record. So Iran might want to say that they want nuclear power for some other reason, but the reason shouldn't be to free up natural gas, either for their population or for export, because that is totally inaccurate, right? And it's inaccurate in many of the other countries that are saying that they need nuclear power to meet electricity shortages in their countries too. And so I leave you with that idea that not only has the United States seen and the US population understand that growing militarization and intervention in the Middle East has not necessarily helped us avoid an oil crisis that would damage our economy, because we've seen one while our troops are 50 times higher than they've ever been in the Middle East, and we have, you know, double the number of naval vessels out floating around in the Persian Gulf, and I think we as Americans can understand that that has not been a successful strategy. It's also a unique time for China to consider the fact that it has exactly the same interests as us, and it really doesn't matter whether you can get 1 more oil field or 2 more oil fields by investing in Iran instead of some other country, that ultimately the impact on every Chinese of this existing financial crisis and the contribution of that to the oil crisis and the hot money bubble flow from petrodollars into these very facilities that then Ponzi schemed and blew up was a great contribution, and we need to understand that process and understand the joint stakes that we have together in stability in the Middle East.
Okay, I would like to open up now the discussion between our panelists and with the audience now. I am struck by in the 3 presentations this morning, Dan Kurtzer talking about alternative models for the export of energy and the security of energy supplies, especially from the Middle East, being a point of possible U.S.-Chinese cooperation strategically. I am also struck by Professor Lee's analysis of that China needs to table constructive and more concise proposals on regional issues, but at the same time that China is watching the elaboration of the Obama administration's Middle East policies very carefully to determine if our Middle East policies are going to change tactically or strategically, and to determine what common ground there may be between the United States and China. And then Amy's elaboration on China's role in the energy sector and focusing on Iran, which of course is a key issue, and possible points of collaboration between the United States and China on Iran, which I think is something that should be very seriously explored by both governments. So the agenda is certainly rich. I want to add another dimension to the U.S.-Chinese agenda, and that nobody has raised today, but is certainly there, and that is the seminal struggle in the greater Middle East between the forces of extremism and moderation, Islamic radicalism and moderation, and that struggle that is mostly ideological and even theological. And the outcome of that struggle is really going to affect the destiny of the peoples in the Muslim world. And of course, the Muslim world is not a monolith, it is a mosaic, and we have to deal with it on a very differentiated basis. Especially US and China should not look at the Muslim world as some sort of monolith. We should be looking at it as a mosaic of different countries, different regions, and different cultures within an overall larger culture. But certainly, the impact of Islamic radicalism, this tension in these societies, in this struggle, is going to really define very much the 21st century as we move into it. We were visited on 9/11 by this issue. China has a problem in its western province, and there are Muslim groups that look upon West China's Xinjiang province as Eastern Turkestan. And so China is not immune, far from it, from this struggle for ideas in the broader and greater Middle East. We see it in terms of the policies of the Iranian regime, which is the first established in 1979 theocratic regime in the Muslim world, and the contemporary Muslim world. And we see it in Al-Qaeda, and we see it in various Islamist groups. So, and as Amy mentioned, this struggle of where is this money going, these incredible petrodollars, if they're going into just arms, that is one factor, but if they're going into education and building up these societies, that will do much to combat the forces of extremism within these countries and within the Muslim world. So the issues are really broad. I see a great deal of convergence of interest between China and the United States in these critical issues that our keynote speakers at our panel today have identified. The issue is whether the United States and China will begin to cooperate and collaborate on Middle East policy in a way they really have not in the past. Certainly the energy sector is a key area of interest. It can become competitive or it can become collaborative. I think our aim should be to construct policies that are collaborative, especially between the US and China, so that we don't get into a zero-sum game in terms of energy security, which is a key issue domestically and internationally. So there are the issues. They're major. They affect both of our countries in a major way. So I'm going to open up the discussion to our audience, to questions, unless Professor Lee or Amy have any comments they would like to make now. Okay, questions from the audience? Yes. Yes, please.
One area that has not been discussed in particular is Pakistan and the privileged relationship that China and Pakistan have enjoyed for years. And I think that there could be a starting point there for cooperation, especially for the fight against terrorism.
It's a good point. I think Pakistan is a major issue. I don't know, Professor Lee, if you would like to comment on that. Or do you have someone in the audience who would like, from the Shanghai Institute, who would like to comment on that? Please.
I don't worry the question, I worry my poor English.
No.
So if you allow it, I ask my colleague to translate.
Please, if the colleague could come up, please come up.
Thank you.
And why don't you... Very good. You could speak in Chinese and he will translate the...
就关于那个中国跟巴勒斯坦的，这个实际上，我是搞中东研究，巴基斯坦其实没有把列落在中东的范围之内，但是据我知道，就中东这个跟这个巴基斯坦有很多的这个联系，在中国的学界。就是说，因为巴基斯坦跟这个中东地区文化上伊斯兰这个圈，所以很多人把那个列入大中东的范围。所以我们觉得这个中东地区的这个恐怖这个很大一部分是跟这个巴基斯坦的这个极端势力是有机联系的。
Actually, I'm not an expert on the Pakistan issue, but because the Pakistan was not belong to my specialities, but as far as I know, China and Pakistan has many links, and in Chinese academic circle, because of the cultural, historical, and Islamic links between Pakistan and Middle East countries, so many scholars regarded Pakistan as one of the fifth sphere of the broad Middle East, and therefore the terrorism in the Middle East area is related to the terrorism in Pakistan.
就说如果是911以前，这个世界是恐怖主义比较集中在中东地区的话，那么在这个以后我们现在看到慢慢的像这个南亚地区包括巴基斯坦、阿富汗这个转移，那么这个呢也是一个新的一个现象。那么现在呢，中东地区这个跟这个巴基斯坦之间的有千丝万的联系。其实世界的恐怖主义现在已经就很难来区分这个是究竟是哪一个地区先放。
Before 9/11, most of the terrorism in the world was focused on the Middle East. However, after 9/11, this kind of things have been changed, and this is a new phenomenon that the terrorism in the Middle East has been spread to the South Asia, including Pakistan and Afghanistan. So it's very hard to differentiate the terrorism belong to which regions.
这个不管是中东地区这个还是巴基斯坦南亚地区的这个恐怖主义，我觉得他们有一个共性，就是说它有它的根源。根源就是说，他对一些问题，就是说，比如说在中东地区，他过去很多就是因为巴勒斯坦问题长期没有得到解决，还有这些地区的这些国家本身的存在的一些社会问题所引起的。那么在这个巴基斯坦同样有这样的问题它除了一些本国的这个社会问题之外也有一些就是说比如说对政府同这个对外关系包括政府的这个对外政策， 包括对美国对这一地区的一些政策都是有很多的关联。所以我觉得，解决这个地区的恐怖分子要是一个综合性的一个治理，而不是简单的采取一些强硬的政策。
No matter what the terrorism in Middle East or in Pakistan, I think they share something in common. That was the root of the terrorism. For example, in the Middle East, the terrorism is related to the Palestinian issue, which was not resolved in a good manner, and also related to the social problems inside most of the Middle East countries. I think the same problem exists in Pakistan, and many social problems and also many resent towards its external relations, external foreign policies, as well as its relations with the United States. So I think in order to resolve these kind of problems, we need comprehensive measures to deal with these kind of things. Thank you.
Thank you very much. A very good translation, by the way. I'm reminded in our last sessions in Shanghai, Professor Yang, I did meet in Beijing with the Middle East envoy, the Chinese Middle East envoy, and I said we would like to get China more involved in what Professor Lee said in terms of the resolution of the Arab-Israeli conflict and the Palestinian issue, which looms so large. And the extremists, as Professor Lee said, exploit the Palestinian issue for their own ends. And your special ambassador looked at me and said, Ambassador Jerejian, does the United States really want China to get involved in the Arab-Israeli conflict? Because we have not been really opening up our arms for Chinese involvement. But that may change. And I think that's what's very interesting in this period now, is as the Obama administration begins to elaborate its Middle East policy, whether we or both our countries will really cooperate together in a much more meaningful, collaborative manner. Hopefully we will. Other questions from the audience? Have we resolved all that? Please come to the microphone, yes.
Just since you mentioned, Ambassador, the Islamic minority in China, in which way the Chinese politics in the Middle East is influenced by the presence of this Islamic population in China?
I'm the wrong person to answer that question. Perhaps Professor Yang, would you like to answer that question? Please come up here.
I'm sorry.
Yes.
To show my respect to you, I think that China has at least 3 factors in mind when designing and implementing our policies in relation to the Islamic or the Muslim world. Number 1, China is a country consists of 56 ethnic groups, and most of the Muslim population lived in a very large area, especially in the north and the south and the west part. And this is the bordering area when we hope that we can maintain peace and development over there. Secondly, China has long been maintaining good relations with Islamic and Arab world. When China was having difficulties, and we thank them for adhering to One China policy, their support for us. And we also think to maintain good relations with these countries is in the interest of the peace and stability in the Middle East countries too. Thirdly, I think China also maintains good relations with Israel. And we hope that this kind of good relation could also be in parallel to our peaceful development and harmonious world. But it is very difficult to integrate these 3 and balance on them all. But I think so far China is doing a relatively good job. But we still keep that because of times of information and the times of globalization. The domestic minority ethnic groups question is immediately linked with the international developments. And so we have to be more careful. But I think we are on the right track. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. Thank you. Yes, please come to the microphone.
There's been discussion here today about getting China involved in the Arab-Israeli conflict as kind of a peace negotiator in the way the U.S. has. And would China be willing to sponsor a two-state system, or would that go against its policy of territorial integrity?
Professor Lee. Basically, does China support the two-state solution between Israel and an independent state of Palestine living in peace and security next to the state of Israel? You can get your interpreter.
Sorry. 关于这个巴勒斯坦建国问题，中国也是一直支持这个巴勒斯坦独立建国。
With regarding to the Palestinian state issue, China is always supportive to this kind of issue.
好，中国的这个立场到现在还是没变。我们通过我们的方式，在做两边的工作。就是说，尽管我们没参加到这个释放机制当中，但是我刚才在发言中提到，一个我们用我们的方式做两边工作，另外呢，我们也希望如果有新的这个解决巴勒斯坦问题的一个机制出现的话，我们会参与其中。作为我个人，作为一个学者，我也建议我们的国家。是不是下一次这个中东问题和会，这个关于巴勒斯坦解决问题能够在中国北京举行
And China's stance remained unchanged with regarding to this issue. And as I mentioned in my presentation, China always try to work with both sides of the peace talks. And although China don't belong to the Quartet and not join the Quartet. And if new regime emerge out of the peace talks, China is happy and ready to get involved. I'm a scholar. As a scholar, I also suggest the Chinese government should take the responsibility to sponsor the next round of Middle East peace talks. But just a suggestion from the scholars.
I think basically, is that China is ready to get engaged in fostering Arab-Israeli peace negotiations in any way it can, especially in a multilateral setting. And I do, if I understood correctly, that China basically, in principle, would support a two-state solution if that's by the agreement of the parties themselves. So that's a good factor in terms of response to your question. We have time for one more question before lunch. Please.
I have a clarification from Amy. Since the oil refining and petroleum technology is relatively, uniform worldwide, and flaring by definition is, done because it's uneconomical, I was wondering where you're talking about the Iranian getting the capacity 8 times to use flaring.
Well, I understand that it's uneconomical, but they're spending billions of dollars building 2 nuclear plants. So if you're saying that the Iranians don't have the money to come up with a plausible manner to take the gas that's being flared and pipe it to facilities where it could be used productively in Iran, I would argue that that would get them a lot more productive energy use for the population than building 2 small nuclear plants. So I understand every country that flares says that it's because it's uneconomical to capture, but I do think eventually we're going to have an international agreement worldwide to end flaring completely. And Iran is one of the countries that's an outlier in terms of its high volume of flaring.
Thank you very much. Let's have a round of applause for our panelists and for this excellent discussion.